Hey, Guy from New Plastic, and today we'll make all sorts of procedural imperfection maps in Octane. Last video we touched on fine-tuning the native noise textures in Octane to get a rich variety of looks, and in this video we'll get a bit more complex and touch on the relatively new custom patterns node in Octane for quick diverse looks and learn how to distort our nodes procedurally using the Distort Mesh UV's projection node, which is pretty essential for all of this. I made a new pack with over 50 procedural imperfection maps like scratches, dust, fingerprints, wipe marks, stains, and more, all fully procedural, so no images used at all. These are for Octane and Cinema 4D, so if you feel like you'll need them, that's a great way to help yourself and help the channel. Another way to support the channel is through Patreon and YouTube subscription, where you'll get the tutorial project files as well as other perks. Follow me on Instagram at Ojang, subscribe, hit the bell, share, comment, stay dangerous. Let's go. So I have the same scene from the last video, same material, and I just left in the main noise we were using last time. So this time I want to go to this custom patterns here, and this is a relatively new addition Octane had with lots of pretty interesting procedural effects that we can use to our advantage. So I'm going here for another scratch surface, and for that I'll use this haggle slag, which is essentially giving us these procedural cake sprinkles. Let's add a transform node and scale it down, and you can see how we're already getting something that feels like many scratches. And we have some options here. We can increase the radius of each sprinkle, which makes each one thicker. Here I'll go for extremely thin lines. We can increase the density here to get more or less lines. Down here we can control the length of each line. Let's keep it around the default length. Now this is good, but these lines are way too uniform and perfect, and we're going to break them up with the projection node set to Distorted Mesh UV, which is also relatively new in Octane. With this we can distort the image's rotation, scale, and position using separate outputs, in this case this noise node. So let's plug it into all these inputs, and you can see how the noise is looking like. Let's solo the haggle slag and start to play with the distortion. If we up the rotation, you can see that something is starting to happen, but it's very subtle. If we scale down the distortion noise, we can start to see the impact much better. And what's happening is the haggle slag is being rotated only where the black parts of the noise are, and is being unaffected where the whites are. If we adjust the rotate Y, the haggle slag will rotate where the white parts of the noise are. And that creates this randomized rotation that randomly breaks the haggle slag, which is perfect for us. And the contrast between the black and the white is pretty sharp because the noise type is set to chips. If we change it to Perlin, we get a much softer distortion. So now let's play with the position, and the effect is really strong. The lines are being smeared really nicely. So we can really lower the amount here. And look how much it shattered those perfect lines. Let's add a gradient node and invert the notches because we want the lines to be black so they're imprinted into the surface. And we can crush the blacks for a higher contrast. And if we take a look, yeah, that's really sick. We can reduce the length of the lines by a little. Very cool. Okay, let's add this noise to a UVW transform node and use it to mask the haggle slag. Let's scale it way down. And now we're hiding the haggle slag wherever the blacks from the noise are, which further breaks the uniformity. And we can play with all these settings and maybe increase the position distortion. And now we really get all this fine surface detail that is just so rich and subtle. We can make it even more subtle by reducing the contrast in the gradient node, but let's make more stuff. Duplicate the material. Let's scale up the haggle slag. And we can bring down the density, bring the position distortion down. And we can also bring down the contrast on the noise to make the distortion more subtle. And also because we scaled it up, let's bring down the thickness of the lines. Cool, and now we can add this blue composite textures node. Then we're gonna click here twice to add 2 layers, and let's plug the haggle slag to the bottom layer, then plug it into a UVW transform node and plug that into the top layer. Plug the composite node to the gradient node, and let's scale up the UV transform. Maybe add some density to the haggle slag. And let's solo the composite texture. Now, if I go to the top layer, for example, we have all these blending options. All these are the same as Photoshop's layer blending options, but we have so much more options here. This really has been a long time coming and gives us really rich ways to blend nodes beyond the classic add, multiply, and subtract. Please do experiment with all of these. Let's try difference. It's a simple blend between the two layers. I can probably reduce the thickness of the lines even more, and definitely a reduction in contrast on the gradient node. And look at that. This is really realistic. Sparse, large, but fine scratches. Perfect. Next one. Duplicate the material, delete all these nodes, and add a noise node. Change the type to turbulence, up the octaves and omega to get a lot of details, slightly up the contrast, and keep the gamma pretty neutral. Now, let's scale it up, but scale it way up on the y-axis so we get these streaks. Now let's scale up the distortion noise, change its type to turbulence as well, bring omega and contrast all the way down, leave gamma pretty neutral, and this will give us a really smooth noise with large movements. Now in the distortion UV node, let's really crank up these settings. So X rotation 15, Y rotation -11, and it's important to make sure the X and the Y numbers don't match. Otherwise, the effect will be invisible if they do match. Okay, bring down the X scale, bring up the Y scale, and bring up the Y position. Now let's try to play with the gamma of the distortion noise. Maybe not. I think we need to scale down the noise. And yeah, now you start to see these swirls. Let's add a color correction node here and just make it brighter. Let's do that here too. Make it slightly brighter, up the contrast and lower the gamma on the whole thing. That's pretty cool. I'll bring down the contrast on this second noise here. And yeah, that feels very smeary. By the way, you see this seam line here? That's the UV seam of the object. And that's important to remember about this projection node is that it uses the object's UV map. You can't use it on a XYZ to UVW projection, for example. So make sure your object has good UVs when you use this node. Okay, we can try to add a bit more randomization by adding a UVW transform node to this noise. Plug that into the rotation distortion and rotate it so we get a different orientation. And if we solo the swirl noise, it doesn't seem like it's doing much. What if we blend both of these nodes with a multiply node and use that as distortion? If we play with a position and orientation of the top one, yeah, that helped a little bit. We can add another layer of details by adding another UVW transform node to this noise and plug it into the brightness slot of the general color correction node. And if we scale it way down, it adds this fine noise overlay to the whole thing, which is great. That really helped sell the look. And I hope you can start to see the power of the UVW transform node. We're getting 3 different uses of a single noise with barely any extra cost on render times or resources. I mean, if we're using one material, it doesn't really matter, but if we start stacking up complex materials, these shortcuts really do help. Okay, next. Duplicate material. And let's just disconnect all of these and put them aside for now. So we're left with this main noise. Let's change the type to circular. Bring the omega way down, bring the Y scale down a little bit, but still keep it slightly larger on the Y axis, but we can scale the whole thing down. Okay, let's bring up the gamma so we get more defined spots. And yeah, that seems about right. That kind of starts to feel like fingerprints, no? Let's add another noise to the power slot, bring the details on it way up, scale it up, add a gradient node to it, and crush the blacks. Maybe scale down a bit and reduce the contrast. And I'll make the black in the gradient some dark gray. So now we're breaking up the uniformity of the ovals. Okay, let's use this circular noise as the amount in the mix node and plug the masking noise to texture 1 through a gradient node and make the whites dark grayish, and plug it also to texture 2 using a different gradient node, make the black mid grayish and the white light gray. Okay, we kind of lost the definition, so let's make the bottom gradient lighter, expose more of the masking on the noise. and up the contrast on it. And yeah, this looks better. The color correction looks okay. Maybe up the gamma a bit. Let's up the contrast on these two gradients. And let's pass this noise through a UVW transform node. And let's scale it way down. Okay, now maybe it's too high contrast, so we'll get the contrast back down. Yeah, this is a lot of back and forth, as you can see, but that's the nature of experimentation, especially when we're working in this way where things are affecting other things to create a rich outcome. And if we see how we're looking, yeah, definitely too shiny. So let's brighten up the color correction to increase the overall roughness. And that really feels like fingerprints to me. So sick. And we can stop here, but you know we won't. These fingerprints are fine, but they're missing one thing. Those swirly fingerprint lines. So let's go back to this group we put aside, which already has those kind of swirly distortions from the last material. Let's duplicate this material and attach the distortion projection node to it. Now let's add a multiply node to the circular noise and blend it with this noise. And if we solo this multiply node, you can see we're getting some swirls. Let's bring all this closer. We can attach this transform node to this noise as well. And let's scale the whole thing down. This all looks pretty good. Let's add a gradient node to it and up the contrast on it. Probably make the blacks much lighter. Might be better to just use the circular noise to mask the swirl noise. Yeah, this looks the same way, so we might as well do that. The gradient node looks pretty bad. Let's make it black again and bring it back. And let's just plug this into the mix node and maybe even crush the whites on the gradient. Yeah, and let's get rid of the multiply node. We don't need it anymore. Bring all this back here. Get rid of this. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much it. I like these swirls. We can increase the contrast on the noise and the gradient to get more defined swirls. And now I'm just playing around with the scale and distortions and contrast to get different fingerprint looks. If you're dealing with a large object, make the fingerprint small. Small object, make the fingerprints larger. Okay, great. Next, duplicate material. Let's get rid of all these and just leave the distortion system. Now, instead of this noise, let's go back to experiment with some more custom patterns. In this menu, we have this procedural effects node, and in it we have this drop down with all sorts of effects. Let's choose particles. So you can see it gives us this texture of kind of like a starry sky. Let's plug the distortion node. And we still have this swirl settings. So let's play with the noise setting, up the details on it. Let's bring the saturation on the color correction all the way down. Reduce the contrast and gamma. Down the brightness a bit. Maybe add a gradient node here and crush the black. So we really get these white specks. And this is pretty dope. We can pipe down the distortion a bit. And I don't think we need all of this here. We can just use this noise, up the details a bit. And yeah, looking pretty solid. Let's see how we're looking. Way too subtle. Let's make the whole thing brighter. Not much of a difference. Let's try with a gradient node, grade to white. Crush the whites. No, this is probably too subtle for the roughness channel. Let's put it in the bump channel. And there you go. Really nice and subtle but rich scuff effect. Let's try another procedural effect from the list. Paint colors. Let's plug it into the roughness channel this time. And let's expose all this white back up. Not this. Maybe less distortion. Nothing much. Let's change the noise type to Perlin. Okay, let's mix up this gradient node with 3 notches from dark to bright to dark. And yeah, that starts to give us some interesting effect. Let's get rid of these two. And there you go. Let's change the interpolation here to cubic, which will give us a softer transition between the notches. And let's just add a bunch of random notches here. Nice. And we can go to the noise and play with the gamma and stuff. Add some more notches to the gradient. There you go. And the cool thing with this procedural effects node is that I can just go and play with the time settings here to instantly get different looks. And I can even animate this setting to get this evolving effect, which is really incredible. Cool. This has this oily, metallic, iridescent feel to it, which is nice. I can get rid of this and just use the noise, and I can maybe try a different procedural effect and play around with the gradient notches. Some of them are but some are really cool. I love the combustible Voronoi. But then we can also go to this other drop down at the top and select different effects from here, like this Voronoi Smooth Contours. Can play around with the frequency, the time. This glossy check adds this kind of fall off effect to the noise. And another one I love is the flakes effect, which we all know from getting a nice car paint texture, but with some cool distortions we can get a unique effect on it as well, a bit sharper and more kind of broken up, which reminds me of the next effect. Here I want to achieve this kind of spangling effect that happens on galvanized steel. So duplicate this material, and this time we'll add the BG noise from the OSL noises menu. Plug that into the gradient, and in the list here, change the type to Voronoi. We can't add a transform node because we're going to change the scale using this rep settings. If I increase the repetition, the noise scales down. Something like this should be fine. Let's bring gain to 0 to reduce the contrast. And by the way, I can simply use the native Cinema 4D noise with Cell Voronoi setting to get the same look. The problem is that the distortion mesh UV projection node simply doesn't work on Cinema 4D noises. So no go. But lucky for us, we have this other OSL noise. So let's plug the distortion projection to it. And I really want to tone down all the distortion and make it very subtle. I think the best way is to change the noise type to chips, something sharp. Reduce the details on it and make the distortion really, really subtle, and scale the noise down so we get distortions on a very fine level, so each Voronoi cell is slightly affected. Okay, let's see how we're looking. Not bad. Let's clean up this gradient node, make the whole thing brighter. Okay, we're almost there. Let's add some more variations by adding another noise. Plugging the XYZ to UVW projection to it. Scaling it down. Adding some details and contrast to it. And let's plug it into value A with a gradient node that has darker tones. And also to value B of the OSL noise with a gradient node that has lighter tones. And we can scale this noise down for some fine details. And we even plug this into the rotation channel and up the anisotropy to get some extra unique specularity. Maybe make the whole thing fully metallic. And yeah, I mean, this is great. I can keep playing around with these settings to try and get a look with less contrast or more contrast. Up to you, up to me. I would have maybe scaled down the cell noise a little bit, but this is really so sick, dude. You can truly do so much with nothing but a procedural workflow. Now look, do I think that every time you need some scratches texture on your bump channel, you should create a whole node system with 6 nodes that are affecting each other in unique ways instead of just slapping a scratch image texture? No. Many times I just slap a nice image texture and call it a day. But one of the reasons it's so important for me to be able to keep it procedural is that a lot of the time in commercial work, especially high-end commercial work, there's an increased need to keep every asset of the project in-house. Bespoke kind of unique assets are essential, not only artistically, but also legally. If you work on $1 million project, nobody wants to have even the slightest possibility of getting sued because you didn't read the last sentence of the royalty-free website rules and laws. Sometimes you buy, textures and all that, and you can use them in your work, but you don't own those textures and you can't just use them on anything. But with this workflow, no one can tell you shit. And even more important than that is this is another way of expressing your creativity. You are working on a machine, you're not painting or sculpting and working with organic material. This is an inorganic, digital, machine-based work, and orchestrating the node system is a huge part of its inherent language and character. I think it's a fascinating language to master in this day and age. I have a lot to say about this, so maybe I'll keep it for another video. Until then, get the Procedural Imperfection Maps pack if you need it from my Gumroad. Consider Patreon and membership, and shout outs to my bequenched patrons and members: Emmanuel Melas, Yin Gong, Guillaume Lopez, Dave Toro, Marie Robbins, Voice Chari, Eric Hu, Daniel Larry, Minky Kim, Hader, Jamie Nix, Leo, Miskick2S, Peter Rodiger, Kenji Shin, Chris Hyde, 3D Monkey Biz, Joel Rieger, Adrian Desolé, Suki Violet Sue, Derek Schultz, Maurice Hickendorf, Arlen, The 22 Design, Studi Image, Matus Jadrzejewski, Blue Hamill, Mark Cragen, Joshua Akoy, Pongsukornim Siri, Webb, Kong Idiot, Matty de Gueldre, Yungjong Cho, Inzi, IEMN, Golfino666, Ali Yasser, RDM, Una Lee, Mouse from Next House, Rom30, and everybody else on the list. Your name is engraved on this shit forever. I love you. Have a great day. Peace.